In the summer of 1902, a man could stand on the eastern shore of the Great Salt Lake in Utah and look out across water so flat and so vast, it seemed less like a lake and more like a pale, dead extension of the sky. The water stretched to the horizon in every direction, shallow and mineral-heavy, under a sun that turned the air into a white haze. And into that haze, day after day, a small army of 3,000 men began to march. They carried with them the tools of a railroad empire: steam pile drivers, steel cables, locomotives, and trainload after trainload of the tallest trees that could be found in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Their task was to build a bridge across this lake. Not a stone arch, not a steel suspension span, but a wooden trestle, 12 miles long, resting on tens of thousands of timber pilings, driven into a lakebed that no one fully understood. If they succeeded, they would cut 44 miles off the most important rail corridor in the United States and eliminate the worst bottleneck on the entire transcontinental line. If they failed, the crossing would swallow the money, the timber, and possibly the men. The real story, though, is not simply that they succeeded. It is what the lake did to them while they worked. The problem they had been called to solve was older than any of them. In 1869, when the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific met at Promontory Summit and drove the golden spike that completed the first transcontinental railroad, the celebration concealed a compromise. The route did not cross the Great Salt Lake. It went around the northern end, climbing 700 feet in 11 miles over the Promontory Range, then grinding through another 500 feet over a spur of the Hogback Mountains near a desolate stop called Kelton. The original builders had been racing for federal subsidies paid by the mile, and the fastest way to claim them was to lay track, any track, even track that made no sense. The lake itself, then in a high water cycle, was considered impassable. So the Transcontinental Railroad was born with a kink in it. For 30 years, every ton of freight between the coasts had to be hauled up and over that kink, requiring helper engines, extra locomotives coupled to the rear simply to push trains over the mountains. It took 3 locomotives to move 950 tons, and the journey across the promontory section often consumed 30 to 36 hours. By the turn of the century, traffic had reached 600,000 tons annually, and the old road had hit its absolute limit. Something had to change. The man who decided to change it was Edward Henry Harriman. In 1901, having already seized control of the Union Pacific, he acquired the Southern Pacific, the successor to the Central Pacific. Harriman was a financier, not an engineer, but he understood infrastructure as a long-term investment at a time when most railroad executives treated their tracks as something to be squeezed for immediate dividends. He found a partner in William Hood, the Southern Pacific's chief engineer, a man who had dreamed for years of routing the line straight across the lake. Hood's problem had always been that no one would pay for it. Now someone would. He showed Harriman that the interest on the investment could be earned. Harriman approved. And in February of 1902, the first workers broke ground. The plan was staggering in its simplicity and its audacity. The new line, called the Lucin Cutoff, would run 102 miles from Ogden to a waterless whistle stop called Lucin on the western side of the lake. It would include 13 miles of rock and gravel fill through shallow brine and, at its heart, nearly 12 miles of permanent wooden trestle across the deepest part of the Great Salt Lake. The trestle alone would require something like 25,000 pilings, driven into a lakebed that ranged from 30 to 34 feet underwater. No structure of this kind had ever been attempted at this scale, and the timetable was brutal. Hood wanted the entire cutoff finished in roughly 2 years. To understand what they were building, you have to understand what was beneath them. The Great Salt Lake is not a normal lake. It is the remnant of an ancient inland sea, its water saturated with salt and minerals, so dense that a man who falls in does not sink the way he would in fresh water, but the brine is corrosive, abrasive, capable of eating through metal and skin alike. The lakebed underneath is not solid. In some places, the bottom is a crust of gypsum so hard that the 3,200-pound hammers of the steam pile drivers could not force a timber through it, and workers had to blast a hole with a steam jet before driving could begin. In other places, the bottom is more than 50 feet of soft mud, silt and clay with the consistency of toothpaste, sitting on top of a layer of Glauber's salt that dissolves under pressure. In those places, a 100-foot pile could be driven entirely out of sight without ever hitting solid ground. It would simply vanish into the muck, and the men would have to lash a second pile to the first and drive them together, hoping the combined friction would hold. No one knew which section was which until the hammer came down. Every pile was a gamble. The scale of the operation defies easy imagination. Southern Pacific assembled a construction fleet sufficient to build a small city. 25 steam pile drivers were fabricated in San Francisco. Over 800 dump cars were purchased or borrowed, along with 400 special steel side dump cars built for this project, each with a 55-ton capacity. 80 locomotives moved nearly 1,000 cars in constant rotation. 8 great steam shovels, each with a 5-cubic-yard bucket, tore into rock and gravel banks at quarries, opened at Little Mountain, Promontory Point, Lakeside, and the Hog-Up Mountains. A 127-foot stern-wheel steamboat named the Promontory, along with 7 tugboats and several launches, carried supplies and assisted with construction on the open water, and the timber was almost beyond comprehension. 38,256 trees were cut to make pilings. Most were Oregon fir, Douglas fir, from the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, and each piling cost about $60 delivered to the lakeside. Some were so long a single tree required 3 coupled flat cars to transport it. Placed end to end, the pilings would have stretched from Chicago to Buffalo. A forest of 2 square miles was, in effect, transplanted into the Great Salt Lake. Above the pilings, the superstructure consumed another 10 million board feet of Douglas fir timbers, plus 2 million board feet of redwood decking. The work began simultaneously from both shores and from Promontory Point in the middle of the lake, the crews driving toward each other, like tunnelers boring through a mountain. At each mile mark, a station was erected. 2 pile drivers were set up back to back and drove away from each other. A good day's work was 5 bents of 5 piles each, 75 feet of progress. Each bent consisted of 5 pilings driven crosswise to the track, spaced 15 feet from the next, fastened with heavy timber caps. On top came 18-foot beams, a foot square, laid crosswise. Above those, 11 timber stringers ran lengthwise. Then, 3-inch redwood planking as a deck, 3 inches of asphalt roofing to seal the wood against the brine, 14 inches of gravel ballast, and finally, the rails. Every component had to be hauled out across the water on the very trestle being built. A temporary trestle was constructed first, just to carry the dump cars and materials to the construction front. The temporary and permanent trestles together consumed a forest that no single accounting could contain. The men who did this work lived on the lake. Boarding houses were built on platforms raised on pilings, set out in the water, away from the shore, to protect them from storm waves. The company furnished supplies and cooks, and the men paid $4 a week for their board. They worked in 10-hour shifts, day and night, Sundays and holidays. At night, electric lights were strung over the gravel pits, so the work never stopped. The heat of the Utah summer on the salt flats was punishing. The cold of winter on the open water was worse. There was no town, no saloon, no entertainment. The company prohibited liquor outright. All packages coming out to the workmen were searched, and any alcohol found was confiscated. Over the course of the project, 2 entire carloads of liquor were seized and destroyed. When enterprising outsiders tried to set up illegal groggeries on government land adjacent to the right-of-way, the railroad dealt with them directly. One bootlegger near Hog-Up refused to leave, so an engineer brought a crew to his shanty and began drilling holes underneath it, preparatory to blowing it up with giant powder. The man fled. The workers were paid between $2 a day for unskilled labor and $4.50 for skilled mechanics, carpenters, and bridge workers. Some were allowed to bring wives and children, housed in converted boxcars called outfit cars, parked on temporary sidings near the sites. At the lakeside quarry, more than 40 of these outfit cars sat in a line, dangerously close to the blasting. When a heavy shot was set off, the cry of "blast" would go up, and every woman and child would crawl underneath their wheeled houses, pressing themselves against the ground while rock fragments sailed overhead. This was their domestic life for the duration. These were not men who had volunteered for adventure. They were laborers, many of them immigrants, working in a salt desert for modest wages, housed over corrosive water, fed from company kitchens, separated from the world by the emptiness of the landscape. And the work was dangerous in ways the payroll books did not capture. Broken bones, smashed fingers, and crushed hands were routine. Men fell into the lake and were nearly strangled by the heavy brine, so dense it coated the lungs and burned the eyes. A carload of dynamite exploded at one point. The company maintained a hospital near the site, staffed by a surgeon, but the record preserves no full count of the dead and injured. The men who built the trestle are, for the most part, nameless now. What remains is the structure they drove into the mud, and the lake fought them at every step. The original estimate proved almost immediately to be wrong. The fill sections, the miles of rock and gravel that were supposed to form the approaches to the trestle, became the project's greatest nightmare. When the first heavy trains rolled out and dumped their loads, the material sank. It sank and kept sinking. The lake bed, that toothpaste consistency clay over Glauber's salt, absorbed the fill the way a sponge absorbs water. For a year and 9 months, the settling continued. One contemporary account called it the stupendous task of filling up the bottomless pit. 2,500 men were assigned to the fill alone, working day and night without cessation. Every hour, at least one material train was pushed out onto the shaky track to dump its tons of rock into what the workers called the greedy, yawning hole. On March 24, 1903, a trial run was attempted across the old Bear River bed. Without warning, the embankment settled beneath the train. The engine stayed on its rails, but dropped into 2 feet of water and had to be hauled out with a cable. The fill was alive. It moved, it was swallowed, and the only answer the engineers had was to keep feeding it. The logistics of keeping the operation alive were almost as daunting as the engineering. Every steam shovel, every pile driver, every locomotive, every steamboat required fresh water to generate steam, and there was no fresh water anywhere near the Great Salt Lake. 500,000 gallons were hauled daily by train from Death, Nevada, 145 miles away, just to keep the boilers running. The salt buildup on the boats was so severe that the vessels had to be washed with steam continually. And on top of all this came the weather. The lake is shallow, and its fetch is long. Winds of 70 miles per hour were not uncommon, and because the water is so salt-heavy, its waves carried roughly 20% more energy than ocean waves of the same height. 8-foot surges would crash across the construction front, smashing log booms and scattering timbers across the lake like spilled matches. The men in the boarding houses would sit idle, playing cards, waiting for the launches to collect the scattered wood and tow it back. Every storm cost days. But the pile drivers never stopped for long. The hammers, 3,200 pounds of dropped steel, fell day and night. In the hard-bottom sections, the pile would rebound 2 or 3 feet after each blow. Barely advancing, the crew forced to switch to a steam jet to cut a pilot hole. In the soft-bottom sections, the pile would plunge and the men would watch it disappear into the mud, and they would know that this bent would require splicing, lashing, and a second pile driven alongside the first. The two lashed together like swimmers holding each other up in deep water. Every 15 feet of progress required 5 piles, driven, braced, and capped. 12 miles of trestle meant roughly 4,240 bents, more than 21,000 individual piles for the permanent structure alone. And every one was driven by men standing on a platform over salt water, guiding a massive timber into position, while a 3,000-pound hammer fell from above. By October of 1903, the last pile of the permanent trestle was driven. October 12, a date noted in the records. The work continued because the trestle was only the skeleton. The stringers, the decking, the asphalt, the ballast, the rails, all still had to be laid across 12 miles of open water, but the bones were in place. The forest that had stood in Oregon now stood in the Great Salt Lake, and it held. On March 8, 1904, just over 2 years after construction began, the Lucin Cutoff opened to through freight traffic. Passenger trains began crossing 6 months later. The total cost was approximately $8,900,000. Staggering, but calculated to pay for itself in saved operating costs within a few years. And it did. Where the old route had required 3 locomotives to move 950 tons in 36 hours, the cutoff allowed a single engine to haul 2,360 tons in less than 9 hours. Passenger trains that had once crawled over the promontory range in multiple sections, each with a helper engine, now ran 14 to 17 coaches on a single locomotive. By 1908, 5 passenger trains and 7 freight trains were using the cutoff in each direction every single day. Thomas Edison visited the site and declared it a bold piece of engineering and well worth seeing. For more than half a century, the trestle carried the weight of American commerce across the Great Salt Lake. It survived storms, ice, and the slow assault of salt water on wood and iron. In 1932, the railroad added 2,038 bracing piles to reinforce the aging structure. The maintenance was relentless, and the cost was rising. And then, in late 1944, the cutoff became the site of one of the worst rail disasters in Utah history. A westbound mail express train, running in thick fog, ran into the back of a slower-moving passenger train on the trestle. 48 people were killed. The fog and the remote location made rescue difficult. The dead were carried off the structure across the same planks that had been laid by men earning $2 a day. The accident did not destroy the trestle, but it underscored what was clear: the wooden structure was aging toward obsolescence. The salt that the asphalt had been meant to seal out had found its way in, year after year, and the Douglas fir that had once been green and strong was now soft in places, checked and grey, held together by habit and maintenance crews. In 1955, the Southern Pacific began construction on a replacement, a solid earthen causeway, built parallel to the trestle, made of rock and gravel from the same quarries that had fed the original fill. The new causeway opened to freight traffic in late 1959, at a cost of roughly $53 million. The trestle was not immediately torn down. It stood beside the causeway for years, a ghost of the original structure, its pilings still rooted in the lake bed, its deck weathering to silver. By the mid-1970s, it was fully abandoned. In 1993, the railroad sold salvage rights to a company called Cannon Structure, which created a division called Trestlewood to reclaim the wood. It took until the year 2000 to fully dismantle the trestle. The wood, 30 million board feet of Douglas fir and 2 million of redwood, was pulled from the lake and found remarkably preserved. The minerals in the brine had penetrated the submerged pilings to their core, staining them with streaks of pink, purple, blue, grey, and black, a coloring that could not be replicated by any modern process. That wood is still being sold today, turned into flooring and architectural elements, carrying the physical chemistry of the Great Salt Lake into buildings across the country. But the story does not end with salvage. The earthen causeway did something the trestle never did. It severed the lake. The open pilings had allowed water to flow freely between the northern and southern arms of the Great Salt Lake. The solid fill blocked that flow. Over decades, the northern arm, cut off from fresh water, grew saltier, while the southern arm, fed by rivers, grew less saline. Today, if you look at an aerial photograph, you can see the line where the causeway divides the lake. The water to the north is red or brown, colored by salt-tolerant bacteria, while the water to the south is green. The railroad's engineering decision, made in 1902 for commerce and efficiency, reshaped the biology of an entire lake. In the 1980s, when heavy flooding raised the lake level by 12 feet and threatened to overtop the causeway, the Southern Pacific dumped 1,430 surplus boxcars along the northern edge, filled them with rock, and buried them in the fill as a desperate seawall. That structure, known as the boxcar seawall, is still there, buried under the causeway, invisible, a monument to a crisis that most people riding the rails above will never know exists. In 2016, the railroad breached the causeway beneath a new 180-foot bridge to let water flow between the arms again. The lake is still adjusting, and what remains of the original trestle, almost nothing you can see from the shore. The pilings were pulled, the decking was removed, the stringers and caps were hauled away. If you stand today at Promontory Point or Lakeside and look out across the water, You see the earthen causeway, a low grey line cutting straight across the lake, and beside it, at water level, the faintest suggestion of where the trestle once stood. A line of shadow in the brine, a ghost of alignment. Some pilings were cut off below the waterline and left in place. They are still there, under the surface, in the mud, coated in salt and mineral, the last fragments of a forest, transplanted from Oregon to Utah, that held up a railroad for 60 years. The rails that cross the causeway today are part of the Union Pacific's Lakeside subdivision, still active, still carrying freight between the coasts. The route is the same, the purpose is the same, only the structure has changed. What persists is not the wood. What persists is the fact of it, that in an age before computers, before powered cranes, before modern geotechnical analysis, 3,000 men stood on a salt lake and drove a forest into the mud and built a bridge 12 miles long, and it worked. They did not know what was under them. They did not have models for the settling of fill on Glauber's salt. They had steam, timber, and their own hands, and a timetable that did not allow for doubt. The men who built the Lucin Cutoff are not commemorated by a monument. Their names are not inscribed on a wall. The boarding houses where they slept over the water are gone. The outfit cars where their children crawled underneath for shelter during blasts are gone. The pile drivers are gone. The steamboat promontory is gone. What they left behind was consumed by the lake they conquered. The salt that ate the trestle, the mud that swallowed the fill, the water that required its replacement. And yet the route they created is still in use. Every freight train that crosses the Great Salt Lake today follows the alignment that William Hood drew on a map and that 3,000 men turned into reality. The modern world still runs on paths carved by people whose names we do not remember, whose labor we cannot fully account for, and whose endurance we have never had to match. The lake remembers them the only way it knows how, in salt, in minerals, in color, in the stubborn persistence of wood that should have rotted and did not.